Riverbend, Mississippi. July 15, 2000. It was a summer night drenched in heat, the kind of humid darkness that clung to the skin and made the air feel heavy. In Riverbend, a small town built along the slow bends of the Yazoo River, life moved at its own pace. Neighbors waved from porches, church bells marked the passing hours, and families trusted that when night fell, nothing dangerous lurked nearby. But that Saturday night would prove them wrong. By morning, Riverbend would wake to headlines no one could have imagined. A young mother murdered in her own home, her children left behind, and no sign of forced entry. Someone Danielle Harris knew and trusted had stepped inside her home, and then taken her life. And yet, the truth of who had done it would remain hidden for nearly 20 years. As we open this case file together, remember to like and subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, so stories like this are never forgotten. Danielle Harris was 29 years old in the summer of 2000. To the people of Riverbend, she was more than just another face in town. Danielle was the daughter who never forgot to call her mother every evening. The coworker who always picked up extra shifts so her team didn't fall behind. The church member who taught Sunday school and made sure every child had a snack after service. More than anything, she was a mother. Her daughter Aaliyah was 7, sharp, observant, and already carrying a sense of responsibility beyond her years. Caleb, just 3, was still all wide eyes and soft curls, happiest when clinging to Danielle's leg as she cooked dinner. Danielle's marriage to Marcus Harris had been strained for months. Marcus, a local mechanic, was living separately at the time, but he remained a presence in the children's lives. Friends said that even as the couple struggled, Danielle was determined not to let her children feel the weight of those problems. She carried a quiet strength, the kind people admired but also sometimes overlooked. Danielle didn't complain even when bills piled high. She smiled through exhaustion, her faith carrying her forward. No one who knew her could have predicted that the very strength she carried, her trust in those closest to her, would be what left her vulnerable. The day itself was unremarkable, which is what makes it unforgettable. That Saturday morning, Danielle dropped the children at her mother's home before heading into work at the medical supply warehouse where she held a steady if demanding job. She spent hours loading boxes, filing paperwork, and answering phones, work that was often overlooked but essential to the community's hospitals and clinics. By late afternoon, she picked up Aaliyah and Caleb, stopping by the grocery store on her way home. A neighbor remembered seeing her in the parking lot, balancing Caleb on one hip while Aaliyah insisted on carrying a bag that was almost too heavy for her. Danielle had smiled, patient and warm as always. Back at her apartment on Willow Lane, she settled into her routine. Dinner was simple: macaroni, baked chicken, and green beans. Afterward, she helped Aaliyah finish a page of handwriting practice while Caleb sat at the table with crayons, drawing wobbly circles that he proudly insisted were trucks. Around 8:30, she bathed the children, read them a short Bible story, and tucked them into their shared bed. Before turning off the light, she whispered the same words she said every night: "Mommy loves you more than anything in this world." The apartment grew quiet. The hum of a fan filled the silence. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. Danielle settled into the worn couch with a notebook, jotting down her budget for the next week, a pencil tapping against the page. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary night. Until it wasn't. Sometime after 11 p.m., Aaliyah woke to the sound of voices. At first she thought she was dreaming. She heard her mother's tone, firm then edged with something unusual: fear. Curious, she crept to the bedroom doorway. What she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life. In the dim light of the living room, Danielle stood facing a figure. A person Aaliyah recognized, someone her mother clearly knew. Danielle's words were sharp now: "You shouldn't be here." The figure moved closer. Aaliyah froze, her small hands gripping the doorframe. She couldn't see the face clearly, only the outline of a man, shoulders tense, movements quick. Then a crash, something falling over, maybe a lamp. Danielle's scream cut through the air, high and terrified, then silenced almost as quickly as it began. Aaliyah stumbled backward, heart pounding. She rushed to her brother's bed, pulling Caleb close, covering his small ears with her hands. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, but no one entered the children's room. And then silence. Thick, crushing silence. For a child of 7, fear became a permanent memory that night. By dawn, Riverbend stirred awake. But inside Danielle's apartment, the curtains remained drawn. The front door stayed closed. She was scheduled to work that morning, and when she didn't arrive, her supervisor grew worried. Danielle was never late, never absent without reason. Phone calls went unanswered. By late morning, a neighbor noticed the mailbox overflowing. Another said the children hadn't been outside to play, unusual for a Saturday. Danielle's mother, concerned after repeated calls went unanswered, drove across town and knocked at the door. No reply. When a Riverbend police officer arrived to perform a welfare check, the scene inside was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Danielle was found in her bedroom. She had been brutally attacked, her body bearing the marks of a violent struggle. Broken glass littered the floor. Furniture was overturned. And yet, the apartment showed no signs of forced entry. The front door was intact, the windows locked from the inside. Her children were discovered in their shared room, frightened but unharmed. Aaliyah clutched Caleb tightly, refusing to let go. She was pale, trembling, unable to answer the officer's questions beyond a whisper. A man came in. The crime scene rattled even seasoned investigators. This wasn't the work of a random intruder. It was personal. Whoever had done this had walked into Danielle's home as if they belonged there. By afternoon, Riverbend buzzed with fear and confusion. Danielle's murder spread quickly, carried by whispers through church halls, barbershops, and corner stores. People who had left their doors unlocked the night before now bolted them shut. Parents kept their children indoors. And speculation bloomed like wildfire. If Danielle had let her killer in, then who in Riverbend could it have been? The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. Danielle was not a stranger, she was family, friend, and neighbor. If she wasn't safe in her own home, no one was. For Aaliyah and Caleb, the world shifted in a single night. Aaliyah's childhood fractured under the weight of what she had seen, images that replayed in her mind with no explanation. Caleb, too young to understand, sensed only that his mother was gone. Their father, Marcus, would soon become entangled in suspicion, but for now he faced the unimaginable, telling his children that their mother would never come back. In a town as small as Riverbend, the Harris family's tragedy was felt by everyone. But no one yet knew that the truth of Danielle's murder was much closer than they realized, and that it would take nearly 20 years and the relentless march of science to uncover the betrayal hidden within her own family. And before long, the whispers of Riverbend would turn toward Marcus himself, setting the stage for one of the most painful chapters in this family's story. The crime scene at Danielle Harris's apartment stunned investigators from the moment they arrived. The overturned furniture, the broken glass, the defensive wounds on Danielle's body, all spoke to the ferocity of the attack. Yet what lingered most was the absence of forced entry. The front door hadn't been kicked in. The windows were locked from the inside. Whoever had killed Danielle hadn't fought their way into her home. They had walked in freely. They had been let inside. And in small-town Riverbend, that narrowed suspicion to the people closest to her. From the first hours of the investigation, Marcus Harris found himself in the glare of suspicion. He was Danielle's husband, though the two were living apart. He worked as a mechanic at a small garage off Highway 49, known for his long hours and grease-stained hands. To those who knew him, Marcus was quiet, sometimes withdrawn, a man weighed down by responsibility. But to investigators he was now something more, the most obvious suspect. The reasoning was straightforward. No forced entry meant Danielle had likely known her killer. Marriages, as detectives often point out, can hide turmoil unseen by neighbors and friends. Domestic disputes, custody battles, financial struggles, these were the familiar storylines behind countless tragedies. And Marcus had a motive, at least on paper. Separation. Strength. Rumors of arguments. It was enough to justify long hours of questioning. Marcus sat across from detectives in a cramped room at the Riverbend Police Department. His clothes smelled faintly of oil and gasoline from the shop. His hands trembled as he rubbed them together, his voice uneven as he asked the question every grieving spouse asks. Have you found who did this? But the detectives weren't there to give him answers. They were there to get them. They pressed hard. Where had he been that night? Could anyone confirm it? Did he and Danielle argue in the days leading up to her death? Marcus insisted he had been working late at the garage and then gone to his brother's place afterward, falling asleep on the couch. He admitted things between him and Danielle hadn't been perfect. They had been separated for months. But he denied any involvement, his voice breaking as he said, "She was still the mother of my kids. I'd never hurt her. Never. To detectives, words meant little. They wanted evidence. The crime scene team moved carefully through Danielle's apartment. Blood samples were swabbed from the carpet and walls. Fingernail scrapings were taken during the autopsy, a sign Danielle had fought her attacker fiercely. But it was the year 2000 in a small Mississippi town. DNA testing existed, but it was limited, costly, and not nearly as precise as it would become years later. The samples were stored, but results were inconclusive. The autopsy confirmed what everyone feared. Danielle had died from blunt force trauma, with additional injuries that pointed to a violent confrontation. She had not gone quietly. Investigators held on to what they could, but the lack of clear forensic evidence left them relying heavily on suspicion and circumstance. And in Riverbend, circumstance pointed back to Marcus. News of Danielle's murder spread quickly. In small towns, stories don't just travel, they root themselves in people's lives. At the grocery store, whispers followed Marcus down the aisles. At the garage, customers canceled appointments, saying they didn't feel comfortable leaving their cars with him. At school, Aaliyah noticed the sideways glances of other parents, the hushed voices when her father came to pick her up. For many in Riverbend, the logic seemed simple. If Danielle let her killer inside, it had to be someone close. And who closer than her husband? Never mind that the police lacked evidence. Never mind that Marcus's alibi placed him elsewhere. In the court of public opinion, Marcus was guilty until proven innocent. At home, Marcus faced the unbearable task of comforting his children while living under suspicion. Aaliyah, still haunted by the figure she had seen, clung to her father but also asked questions he couldn't answer. "Daddy, was it you?" she whispered once, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his face. Marcus broke down in tears, holding her tightly, swearing over and over, "No, baby. No. I'd never do that." Caleb was too young to understand, but he sensed the tension. He would crawl into Marcus's lap at night, small hands gripping his father's shirt as if afraid he too might disappear. For Marcus, grief and suspicion collided in unbearable ways. He had lost his wife, but he had also lost the trust of his community. Weeks turned into months. Detectives circled back to Marcus again and again, re-interviewing him, checking his alibi, pressing for inconsistencies. But none surfaced. Other leads were scarce. A neighbor reported hearing a loud thud that night, but no one saw anyone enter or leave the apartment. A co-worker recalled Danielle mentioning feeling uncomfortable around someone she knew, but she never named who. The evidence remained frustratingly inconclusive. No fingerprints pointing to an intruder. No DNA match that could be tied to anyone specific. Just scraps of information that led nowhere. By early 2001, the investigation had stalled. Officially, the Riverbend Police Department marked the case as inactive, the term they used for files that had no new leads. Danielle's murder joined the growing list of unsolved crimes. For the Harris family, the case was anything but inactive. Aaliyah grew quieter, more withdrawn, holding on to memories she couldn't fully understand. Caleb grew up with only the faintest recollections of his mother's voice. And Marcus, though technically cleared by police, could never clear his name in Riverbend. Neighbors who once waved from porches now closed their doors. At church, whispers followed him down the aisle. Job offers fell through. Even family members kept their distance, unsure of what to believe. It was as though Danielle's death had not only taken her life but also stolen the future Marcus and his children might have had. By the end of 2001, the Harris case file sat in a cabinet, gathering dust. The blood samples, the fingernail scrapings, the photographs, all locked away waiting for a future when technology might catch up. For Marcus, every day was the same. Wake up before dawn. Pack lunches for the kids. Work long hours at the garage. Come home to a house too quiet, memories too loud. He carried the weight of suspicion everywhere he went. Once, after attending Sunday service, Marcus found his car windshield smashed in the church parking lot. No note, no confrontation, just a silent message that said, "We don't believe you." And though he told himself the truth would come out one day, deep down he feared it never would. The murder of Danielle Harris had shocked Riverbend. But by the close of 2001, it had also faded into the background. One more unsolved crime in a world where justice often moved too slowly. Her name vanished from the headlines. The investigation slipped into silence. And while the town moved forward, Danielle's children grew up under the shadow of unanswered questions. For the Harris family, time did not heal. It only deepened the wound while somewhere out there a killer walked free. The Harris case had once dominated conversations in Riverbend. Danielle's murder was on every front page, in every church prayer circle, and on every neighbor's lips. But as months turned to years, the shock dulled into routine silence. Other stories filled the news. Other tragedies claimed the town's attention. And so, Danielle's name began to fade. For law enforcement, it was a file boxed away in storage. For the community, it became a memory people didn't want to revisit. But for her family, for Marcus, for Aaliyah, for Caleb, it was a wound that never closed. Aaliyah Harris was 7 the night she saw the shadow in the living room, the night she heard her mother scream. In the years that followed, that memory became both her burden and her identity. Teachers noticed her slipping grades, her withdrawn demeanor, her tendency to watch doors and windows as though danger might step through at any moment. By middle school, she rarely spoke of her mother's death, but it defined her. Some classmates whispered about it, cruelly or curiously, and Aaliyah would shut down. Others offered pity she didn't want. All she wanted was answers. Caleb, just 3 when Danielle was killed, grew up with only fragments. A scent of her perfume when unpacking an old box. A lullaby remembered faintly in dreams. To him, Danielle was more story than memory, a mother shaped through photographs and whispered recollections. Marcus tried to fill both roles, father and mother, but his efforts were never enough. The loss hovered over their home like a constant presence. Family dinners were often silent. Holidays felt incomplete. And though Marcus loved his children fiercely, the weight of suspicion he carried from the community made every step forward heavier. In Riverbend, Marcus Harris never truly escaped the shadow of suspicion. Police had not charged him. Evidence had not pointed to him. Yet neighbors looked at him differently. Years after the murder, people still crossed the street when he approached. Some refused to let their children play with Aaliyah and Caleb. At the garage, customers quietly took their business elsewhere. Marcus knew the truth. He had not killed his wife. But proving innocence is harder than proving guilt. And so, Marcus lived in 2 prisons. One without walls, built by gossip and rumor, and another within himself, where grief and anger circled endlessly. By 2005, Danielle's murder was officially considered a cold case. Detectives had long since moved on. Files sat in dusty cabinets, evidence stored in freezers that few ever opened. When Marcus asked about updates, he was often met with polite but hollow replies, "We'll let you know if anything new develops." But nothing ever did. For many in Riverbend, Danielle's story was no longer an open wound, it was an uncomfortable scar, easier to ignore than to confront. But for her children, the silence was unbearable. As Aaliyah entered her teenage years, she found herself caught between memory and responsibility. She remembered enough of that night to know her mother had let someone familiar inside, but not enough to know who. That gap haunted her. Had she missed a detail? Should she have spoken louder when she whispered to police? Was the figure taller than her father? Shorter? Did she hear a name, a voice? She turned those questions over and over in her mind, replaying the moment like a broken tape. But answers never came. At school, the wait showed. Once, when classmates planned for the spring dance, a friend asked if her mom was helping her pick a dress. Aaliyah froze. She didn't go to the dance. Caleb's silence was different. He grew up without the sharpness of memory. For him, grief was abstract. He saw photos of Danielle, her smile wide, her arms around him as a toddler, and felt the loss in ways he couldn't fully articulate. In elementary school, when other children made Mother's Day cards, Caleb drew one too. But he wasn't sure what to write inside. He tucked it away in his desk, ashamed to show it. As he grew older, he often asked his sister what she remembered. Sometimes Aaliyah told him pieces. Sometimes she shook her head, unable to revisit the nightmare. For Caleb, his mother became a question he couldn't answer. And that question shaped the young man he became, searching for identity in a world that had robbed him of one of the people meant to define it. By the late 2000s, Riverbend had moved on. New businesses opened. The town expanded slightly. For many, Danielle Harris's name was a ghost of the past, a story too uncomfortable to resurrect. Even when the 10-year anniversary of her death passed in 2010, no official memorial was held. No candlelight vigil. No mention in the local paper. Only Marcus and his children marked the day quietly at her grave. For the family, it was another reminder. Riverbend preferred forgetting. Outside Riverbend, the world of criminal investigation was changing. By 2010, DNA technology had advanced significantly. What once required large, clean samples could now be done with the smallest trace. Cold case units across the country began reopening files, using modern science to re-examine evidence once considered useless. But Riverbend was not a big city. Its police department had limited resources, no dedicated cold case unit, and little political will to revisit old wounds. Danielle's file remained untouched, until persistence, and the voices of her family, began to change that. Marcus Harris never stopped calling. Year after year he checked in with police. Year after year he asked the same questions. Have you tested the evidence again? Is there anything new? Most of the time he received polite deferrals. But Marcus's persistence mattered. It kept Danielle's name alive in the department. It kept the case from being completely buried. And it gave him something to hold on to, a promise to his children that he would not let their mother be forgotten. Before we continue, let me ask you, what would you do if you were in Marcus's position? Imagine being suspected of the crime you didn't commit, carrying that weight while also raising 2 children alone. Would you stay in that town, fighting to clear your name? Or would you leave, start fresh elsewhere, even if it meant walking away from the only place your family had ever called home? Let us know in the comments what you think. By 2012, Aaliyah was 19, standing on the edge of adulthood, still carrying the trauma of her childhood. Caleb was 15, beginning to ask harder questions about the mother he barely remembered. Marcus knew he couldn't give them the answers they needed. Only the truth, the real truth about Danielle's killer, could do that. And for now, that truth was locked in boxes of evidence no one was testing. But in 2014 something would shift. Across Mississippi, state funding began flowing into cold case reviews. Departments were encouraged to revisit old files, to resubmit biological evidence for modern DNA analysis. And for the Harris family, the silence that had defined their lives for 14 years was about to break. For over a decade, Danielle's murder had been a ghost story in Riverbend, unsolved, unspoken, unresolved. Her children had grown up in the shadow of unanswered questions. Marcus had carried a burden no man should ever bear. But science was catching up. And when investigators finally reopened Danielle's file, the evidence that had once been inconclusive would begin to tell its story. The fingernail scrapings, the blood swabs, the traces Danielle had left behind in her desperate fight, they were about to speak. A story that pointed not to Marcus, not to a stranger, but to someone else, someone much closer. By 2014, Danielle Harris's murder was 14 years old, a case nearly forgotten by everyone except her family. In the dusty archives of the Bay County Sheriff's Office, her file sat buried under a stack of unsolved crimes. Photos curled at the edges. Evidence boxes bore the fading labels of another era. For years, the case had been considered unsolvable, too little evidence, too much time gone by. But across Mississippi, something was shifting. The state had recently expanded funding for forensic reviews, encouraging departments to revisit long-stalled cold cases. DNA technology, once expensive and limited, was now sharper, faster, and more precise than ever before. Samples that had once yielded inconclusive results could now tell entire stories. Trace evidence once dismissed as too small could now generate complete profiles. For Danielle Harris, it meant something her family had long prayed for. Her case was pulled from storage. A young investigator, Detective Carla Jennings, was assigned to review the file. To her, Danielle was not just another statistic. She was a young mother, violently killed in her own home. And Jennings believed the answers were still waiting inside the evidence box. When Jennings opened Danielle's case file, she found the familiar details. The photographs of the apartment, the reports of no forced entry, the statements from Marcus Harris insisting on his innocence. But what caught her attention were the items sealed in evidence bags. Fingernail scrapings collected during Danielle's autopsy, blood swabs taken from the living room carpet, and a partial print that had never been fully analyzed. Back in 2000, those samples had been stored away as little more than question marks. Now Jennings believed they could be the key. The evidence was carefully transferred to the state crime lab. Technicians in white coats and gloves handled each item with meticulous care. First, the fingernail scrapings. Danielle had fought back fiercely, and the hope was that in doing so, she had scratched her attacker and preserved a piece of him beneath her nails. Then the blood swabbed from the carpet. Investigators had long assumed most of it belonged to Danielle, but could a portion have come from her killer? And finally, the partial print, too smudged for analysis in 2000, but now potentially recoverable with advanced imaging software. The lab machines hummed. Computers lit up with data. And slowly, after 14 years, Danielle's evidence began to speak. Weeks later, Detective Jennings received the call. The DNA profile from the fingernail scrapings was ready. She held her breath as the analyst explained, the DNA belonged to a male. It was not Danielle's. And most importantly, it was not Marcus Harris. For the first time since 2000, Marcus was not just cleared by lack of evidence. He was cleared by science. When Jennings delivered the news, Marcus broke down in tears. For 14 years, he had lived under a cloud of suspicion. In his town, at his workplace, even in the eyes of his children. Now the truth was finally on paper. "I told you," he whispered through sobs. "I told you I didn't do this." It was vindication, but it was also agony. 14 years of lost peace could never be returned. The profile did not immediately match anyone in the national database. That meant the killer had never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA submission. So investigators turned back to the case file. Who had been close enough to Danielle to be in her apartment that night? Who had motive, opportunity, and history? Neighbors were re-interviewed. Friends were called again. Family members revisited. And slowly, a troubling picture began to emerge, one name appearing again and again. Anthony Lewis, Danielle's brother-in-law. Anthony had been Marcus's younger brother. In 2000, he was a frequent visitor to Danielle's apartment. Neighbors recalled seeing him there often, sometimes when Marcus was away. Danielle had once confided in a friend that Anthony's behavior made her uncomfortable. He lingered too long, stood too close, made comments that crossed lines. But back then it was brushed aside as awkwardness, not danger. Now, with Marcus cleared, those old comments carried new weight. Digging deeper, investigators uncovered something darker, Anthony's pattern of entitlement. Friends described him as a man who believed the world owed him more respect, more success, more attention. And when it came to Danielle, that entitlement twisted into obsession. To him, she wasn't his brother's wife. She was a prize he deserved, no matter the cost. At this point, let's pause and ask you, the viewer. Imagine waiting 14 years under a cloud of suspicion, only for science to finally prove your innocence. Would you forgive the years lost, the friendships gone, the reputation destroyed, or would that lost time haunt you forever? And what about Anthony? If you were in the investigator's shoes, would you trust memories and suspicions from over a decade ago, or would you demand only hard evidence before moving forward? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective matters in stories like these. Determined to follow the lead, Jennings ordered the blood swabbed from the living room carpet to be tested next. The results came back, a mixture. Danielle's blood was present as expected. But alongside it, a male DNA profile, the same one found beneath Danielle's fingernails. Two independent samples now pointed to the same unknown male. And the partial fingerprint? When enhanced through modern imaging, it too provided enough detail to compare against known prints. It was run through the system, and while no national match appeared, the shape and ridges aligned with Anthony Lewis's fingerprints taken from an old traffic violation. Jennings felt the case tightening like a noose. In late 2015, Anthony Lewis was brought in for questioning. Now in his mid-40s, his hair thinner, his life marked by a series of small infractions. Unpaid tickets, bar fights, odd jobs that never lasted. When confronted with the DNA results, Anthony denied everything. He claimed he had never hurt Danielle, that the DNA must have been a mistake, contamination, or coincidence. But Jennings pressed harder. How did his DNA end up beneath Danielle's fingernails? How did his blood end up on her carpet? Anthony had no answers. His silence spoke louder than his words. By the end of 2015, the cold case of Danielle Harris was no longer cold. DNA had cleared Marcus Harris, finally lifting a weight he had carried for nearly half his life. And suspicion had shifted squarely onto Anthony Lewis, the brother-in-law once dismissed as awkward, now emerging as the prime suspect. For Marcus, the thought was unbearable, that while he was living under suspicion, the real killer may have sat across from him at family gatherings, shaking his hand, smiling in photographs. The evidence was speaking. The past was catching up. And the Harris family was about to learn that betrayal can come from the person sitting closest to you at the dinner table. When Anthony Lewis first appeared in Danielle Harris's case file in 2000, he was little more than a name on a list of family members. He had been interviewed briefly, offered nothing useful, and faded into the background as suspicion focused squarely on Marcus. But in 2015 all of that changed. DNA had spoken. The profile from Danielle's fingernails and blood-stained carpet matched Anthony Lewis. And suddenly the awkward younger brother, once dismissed as harmless, was the center of a murder investigation. Anthony Lewis was not a stranger to Danielle. He had been around the Harris family constantly, at birthdays, at Sunday dinners, at neighborhood gatherings. Danielle had endured his presence out of obligation, but to her close friends she sometimes confided that Anthony made her uncomfortable. "He doesn't respect boundaries," she told one friend in 1999. "He looks at me like I'm something he can have, not like his brother's wife." At the time, her words carried little weight. People brushed it off as awkwardness. But in 2015, as detectives revisited those comments, they read like warnings, signals that had been ignored. When investigators confronted Anthony with the DNA evidence, his reaction was telling. At first he laughed it off, insisting the samples were contaminated. Then he grew defensive, claiming he had cut himself in the Harris apartment weeks earlier, leaving traces of his blood behind. But Detective Carla Jennings pressed harder. "That doesn't explain why your DNA is under Danielle's fingernails," she said, sliding a photograph across the table, an image of Danielle's hands, the nails broken and sharp from her final struggle. Anthony's face tightened. For the first time he was cornered by more than suspicion. He was cornered by science. When Marcus heard the news, his world tilted. For 14 years, he had carried the weight of suspicion, enduring whispers that he had killed the woman he loved. Now the truth pointed to someone else, his own brother. The betrayal was staggering. Marcus thought back to the years after Danielle's murder, when Anthony had sat in his living room, offering condolences. When Anthony had hugged Aaliyah and Caleb at family gatherings. When Anthony had stood silently beside him at Danielle's funeral. And all the while Anthony had known the truth. For Aaliyah and Caleb, the revelation was another wound. The man who had tucked them into bed when their father worked late, who had offered to take them for ice cream, who had been part of their extended family, was the same man who had taken their mother from them. The sense of betrayal ran deeper than the crime itself. It was not just murder. It was treachery within the family. Faced with mounting evidence, Anthony's bravado began to crack. In late 2016, while in custody for an unrelated bar fight, he was re-interviewed about Danielle's murder. This time the walls closed in. Jennings presented the DNA results, the blood match, the fingerprint analysis. Anthony sat in silence for a long moment. Then in a low, flat voice he confessed. He admitted to visiting Danielle the night of March 12, 2000. He admitted she resisted his advances. And he admitted that in anger and humiliation he struck her, then strangled her, leaving her children asleep in the next room. The details he provided matched the crime scene exactly. He knew where she had fallen. He knew how the living room lamp had toppled. He knew things only the killer could know. The confession was chilling not because of its content, but because of its lack of remorse. Anthony's confession secured his arrest, but the road to trial was slow. The defense attempted to challenge the DNA evidence, arguing contamination and mishandling over the years. They claimed Anthony's confession had been coerced, the result of fatigue and pressure. For the Harris family, it was agony all over again. Each hearing, each delay, each appeal felt like a reopening of the wound. Marcus sat through it all, every motion, every argument, determined that justice for Danielle would not be delayed any longer. Aaliyah and Caleb, now young adults, sat beside him, their mother's memory burning like a flame that refused to go out. In January 2021, Anthony Lewis finally stood trial for the murder of Danielle Harris. The courtroom was tense, filled with reporters, community members, and the Harris family. The prosecution laid out the case with precision. DNA beneath Danielle's fingernails, blood on the carpet, fingerprint analysis, and Anthony's own confession. Witnesses testified about his behavior toward Danielle, her discomfort, and his presence in her home on multiple occasions. The defense tried to sow doubt. They claimed Anthony's DNA could have been transferred innocently, that his confession was unreliable, that the evidence had degraded over time. Then came the emotional heart of the trial. Aaliyah, now a young woman, took the stand. She spoke of the fragments of memory from that night, of growing up without her mother, of living under the weight of unanswered questions. Her voice trembled, but her words cut through the courtroom. He took her from us. And he let us grow up believing maybe our dad had done it. That's something I'll never forgive. When the verdict was finally read, guilty of murder in the second degree, the Harris family embraced in tears. For Marcus, it was the first time in 21 years that relief washed over grief. When the sentence was announced, Marcus closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 2 decades. For 14 years he had carried suspicion. For another 6, he had carried the burden of waiting for trial. Now at last justice had been served. But as he later admitted, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice came, he said softly, but it came too late for Danielle. Too late for the life we could have had. Too late for the years my kids grew up without her. Still, it was justice. And for the first time in years, Marcus could walk into his community without the shadow of guilt hanging over him. For Aaliyah, the verdict was closure she had longed for since childhood. But it also brought new grief. I spent so many years trying to remember that night, trying to hold on to every detail, she said. Now I know the answer. But I also know it was someone we trusted. That's a different kind of pain. For Caleb, who had grown up with more questions than memories, the trial gave him clarity. I finally know who did it, he said. But it doesn't give me back a mom. It doesn't erase what we lost. When news of Anthony's conviction spread, Riverbend was stunned. For years the community had whispered about Marcus. For years they had crossed the street to avoid him, looked at him with suspicion. Now the truth was undeniable. Marcus had been innocent all along. Some offered apologies. One neighbor, who had once refused to let her children play near the Harris home, came to Marcus after the trial and said, "I was wrong. I judged you. And I'm sorry." It didn't erase the years of silence and suspicion, but for Marcus, it was a sign that the truth, though delayed, still had the power to heal. By 2021, Anthony Lewis was behind bars, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. The Harris family finally had answers. But justice, while welcome, could not heal every wound. Danielle's children had grown up without her. Marcus had lost years of peace. And the community had learned the hard truth that evil can sometimes wear the face of family. Yet the case of Danielle Harris also stood as proof of something larger. The power of persistence, the importance of science, and the reality that even the coldest cases can one day be solved. By 2021, the Harris family had an answer they had waited more than 2 decades to hear. Anthony Lewis, the man who had lived within their circle, who had smiled at family gatherings and offered hollow condolences, was convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison for the murder of Danielle Harris. Justice at last had been delivered. But justice is never simple. It does not erase the years stolen. It does not fill the empty chair at the dinner table. It does not replace the warmth of a mother's embrace or the comfort of a wife's voice. For Marcus, Aaliyah, and Caleb, the verdict was a turning point, but it was not the end of grief. When the gavel fell and Anthony was sentenced, Marcus Harris sat in the courtroom with tears streaming down his face. Not tears of victory but of release. For the first time since March 2000, he was no longer under the cloud of suspicion. For years, Marcus had been the whispered about husband. The man neighbors looked at twice when he walked down Main Street. The father other parents warned their children about in hushed tones. He had endured suspicion at work, in church, even within his own extended family. Now finally he could walk through Riverbend without feeling eyes on his back. But freedom came at a cost. You don't just shake off 20 years of being accused, Marcus once told a reporter. You carry it with you. It changes the way you trust people. It changes the way you trust yourself. He had been vindicated, but vindication does not return the lost years. It does not erase the hollow birthdays, the sleepless nights, or the questions from his children he could not answer. Still, for Marcus, the truth mattered. The record had been set straight. And Danielle's memory was no longer entangled in lies. For Aaliyah, who was only a toddler when her mother was taken, the trial was both healing and devastating. She had lived her life piecing together fragments of memory, the sound of her mother's laugh, the feel of her hand, the sight of her smile in photographs. As she grew older, those memories blurred, replaced by the stories others told. Teachers described Danielle's kindness. Neighbors spoke of her warmth. Marcus spoke of her strength. But none of it replaced what was stolen. When Aaliyah took the stand in 2021, she spoke with the weight of 2 decades on her shoulders. She told the jury about growing up without a mother, about wondering if her father was guilty, about living in the shadow of a question no child should have to ask. After the trial, she described the verdict as a kind of release. "It didn't bring my mom back," she said, "but it gave me something I never had before, the truth. And sometimes that has to be enough." Caleb was just a baby when Danielle was murdered. He had no memory of her, only stories and photographs. For years, he carried anger at the unanswered questions. When the truth finally came, his anger shifted. It wasn't just at Anthony. It was at the years lost, at the community that had doubted his father, at the silence that had hung over his childhood like a storm cloud. "I finally know who did it," Caleb said after the verdict. "But I'll never know my mom. That's the part that hurts the most." For him, the trial was not just about accountability. It was about reclaiming the memory of his mother from suspicion and lies. The town of Riverbend, Mississippi, also had to face its reflection in the mirror. For 14 years, many had believed Marcus was guilty. Some avoided him. Some whispered behind his back. Some treated his children differently, as though guilt were hereditary. Now, the truth demanded accountability. One neighbor who had once crossed the street to avoid Marcus approached him after the trial. With tears in her eyes, she said, "I was wrong. I didn't believe you. I'm sorry." Marcus accepted the apology, but the scar remained. The trial had shown that small communities, for all their closeness, could be quick to judge and slow to forgive. It was a painful lesson for Riverbend. Justice requires patience. And suspicion, when misplaced, can destroy lives. Danielle Harris's case was more than just a tragedy. It was a turning point, a reminder of what science can do when persistence meets opportunity. In 2000, DNA evidence was limited, costly, and often inconclusive. By 2015, technology had advanced enough to generate profiles from tiny samples once considered useless. Danielle's fingernail scrapings, stored for years in a sealed envelope, became the key to unlocking the truth. Her case demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, of funding cold case units, of never assuming that time erases possibility. For investigators, it was proof that no case is truly unsolvable. For families, it was hope. Hope that even after decades, the truth can still emerge. Through all the years of trials, delays, and accusations, it was easy to lose sight of the woman at the center of the case. Danielle Harris was more than a victim. She was a mother who tucked her children into bed with lullabies. She was a neighbor who brought sweet potato pie to block parties. She was a daughter who called her parents every Sunday. Her life mattered, not just because of how it ended, but because of how she lived. In the years after the verdict, her children and Marcus worked to ensure she was remembered not for her death, but for her spirit. A scholarship was created in her name at the local high school. A memorial bench was placed at Willow Creek Park, where she used to take Aaliyah to play. The bench is simple yet powerful. Bronze lettering bears her name, "In loving memory of Danielle Harris, 1976 to 2000. Forever a mother, forever loved." Children still run and laugh in the park, just as Aaliyah once did, their voices carrying over the water. Parents sit nearby, sometimes pausing to read the plaque. For those who stop, Danielle's story becomes more than an episode of history. It becomes a reminder that love, though cut short, can endure. Danielle's case reminds us that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. It reminds us that science can speak for the voiceless. And it reminds us that families left behind carry not only grief, but resilience. For Marcus, the trial was a release. For Aaliyah and Caleb, it was an answer. For Riverbend, it was a reckoning. And for all of us, it is a story worth remembering, because stories like Danielle's ensure that even in the coldest of cases, truth still matters. And as we close her file one last time, we are reminded of how it began. A locked door, no sign of forced entry, and the chilling truth that the danger came not from a stranger, but from within the family circle. We'll leave you with this question. Do you believe justice delayed is still justice delivered? Or do the years lost make it something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective is what keeps these conversations alive. This has been the Cold Case Archive. Thank you for joining us as we preserve these stories one file at a time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that the memory of these cases lives on.